So welcome to my Qingque guide. This is my first proper guide for Star Rail. It took me a long time to really think about how I wanted to do theory crafting in Star Rail, and oh my god, these calcs took such a long time to do. I kind of regret doing all this, but now I'm finally finished with these calculations, so let's get into the guide. So for context, I do MOC 10 with Qingque every cycle, and I've also done the highest swarm difficulties with her too. But before I get into the video properly, I do want to show off my Qingque build though, just so you see what I'm working with. If anyone does remember my early Star Rail content, I have been impressed with Qingque and hyping her up ever since the first week. You can see there's even this community post which I think aged pretty well. The way we got her for free from Forgotten Hall, and that she has so much buffing potential. I just got this feeling that Hoyo did the exact same thing with Qingque that they did with Xiangling back in Genshin 1.0. And I know it's a cliche thing to say now, but I do think it's a bit true. And even when I did get Zila, I couldn't really stop playing Qingque instead. And for reference, I got her up to eidolon 2 in 1.0 randomly, and then I pulled for Luocha in 1.1 and I got her E6 there. And as many of you may know already, once you get that E4 and E6, then she just goes through the roof. But having said this, if you don't like a character's design or looks or gameplay, then don't play them, especially with a DPS. I always advocate pulling and playing who you like, and I like Qingque, so that worked out well for me. Obviously, Star Rail is similar to Genshin, I think, and all these DPSs all use the same broken supports, so in both games, the DPS is kind of just whichever flavor you like the most. These are my relics. I think these are pretty good, but they took a lot of time to farm. Majority of time, I got mostly trash, and pieces like this were just a breath of fresh air. I still haven't managed to get a good set for the last two relics though, but hopefully I can work on that. I think it's important to cover the biggest misconception with Qingque. Something along these lines: she is S tier if you get lucky, or D tier if you get unlucky. And I'm sure you guys have kind of heard this from so many communities and people across the internet when you ask about her. And honestly, I kind of think it's just an issue from people just reading her kit without playing her much, or they only tried her once or twice at lower eidolon levels. And hopefully you agree for anyone who does play her at high eidolons. Let me know in the comment section, but I feel like even with bad luck, she doesn't just drop and become a mid character. I think a lot of people just want to brush her off and maybe dismiss her in favor of limited banner DPS. I know the same thing happened with Genshin, where a lot of the early 4 stars were underestimated because in the beginning of the game, people were really focused on their 5 stars. So we can break this misconception down. First of all, what is bad luck for Qingque? And this is probably another misconception in itself, but if you read her kit, you might think that getting tiles quickly to save SP is lucky, and if you have to spend a lot of SP rerolling tiles, that's unlucky. And actually it's the opposite of that. The more you reroll her tiles, the more damage buffs you get, and the more likely she is to get her eidolon 4 or Tarki follow-up attack buff to get the extra hit. And I think now that Dunhung 5-star is out, I think people understand this better now, which is, it's an advantage that these characters can swallow up the team's SP in order to front load all those turns into one big turn of damage. And I'll cover this later in the video, but we also know that this maximizes team buffs better too. And even then, Qingque can abuse this further and extend buffs, which I'll also cover later too. So basically, I think there's only a few things that I would consider unlucky with her. Number one is getting tiles instantly. Whilst this does save you SP, it makes you unable to buff her further or get her follow-up attack. Number two is you rolling a ton of tiles, spending a lot of SP, and you're never hitting full hand. If you have your ultimate and this happens, you can actually use the ultimate and it will give you the free hand. But if you don't have the ultimate available, you kind of end up missing out. And number three, it's just not getting her follow-up attack or Tarki when she is fully buffed up. You lose out on kind of double damage. Now, however, if you do play her with Bronya as a support, then the first point isn't really that bad. when you get tiles instantly and you attack, yes, your attack will deal low damage. And if you have an eidolon 6, you can just take that low damage and you can take that SP refund after the basic attack. And then you can just go to Bronya's turn and you can reload Qingque with Bronya, buff her up and try again. So in conclusion, whilst I can definitely admit she definitely does vary in performance depending on your luck, I think the community exaggerates it more than it really is. In fact, I think it's pretty reasonable to say that they designed her kit to work well either way. You can spend SP, you can roll tiles and you can do big damage, or you can get tiles early, you can do mid damage, but you can generate SP and try again. And yeah, to put it simple, I feel like you kind of win either way. Although I do think it's more of a win to fully commit to her damage, to spend a lot of SP and to just deal big damage. So how to play Qingque? So she is the main damage dealer for your team, and to do that damage she does need to take a lot of SP. This is very similar to Dan Heng, but they are very worth it because you will use your team's SP well. Basically, your team does have to use SP, so it might as well be the big damage dealer. And so you do need to balance using SP on teammates to buff her versus just basic attacking on them in order to generate SP. And I would say, as a general rule of thumb, ideally having 3, maybe 4 SP by the time you do get to Qingque's turn is a very comfortable area. Her kit is all about rolling to get 4 matching tiles, and after which you can do the enhanced basic attack. To be honest, in practice, once you figure her out, you rarely do use her plain basic attack, only when you get really unlucky. So we can break it down simply. There's 3 ways she can roll tiles. Number 1 is she slowly does it off field as each other character takes their turns. This is good so you don't have to get an entire 4 matching tiles from scratch on her turn. Number 2 is you roll it directly on her turn using her skill. This is the most important one because, as we said before, the more you use her skill, the more she buffs herself with very significant buffs, and also the more likely you are to get her follow-up attack if you have an eidolon 4. And then number 3 is when you use her ultimate, you will automatically get 4 matching tiles. However, that doesn't mean you should just be instantly using her ultimate whenever it comes up, which we'll get into. So one of my favorite things about Qingque is that she's so flexible with dozens of combos you can probably do depending on the situation. You'd think that Star Rail is a turn-based game and each character has a basic attack, a skill, an ultimate and a talent, and that's it. But Qingque probably has the most diverse mechanics you can have in the game. Even with the exact same team and teammates, there's so many different things you can do. You might think that saving SP is good, but not really. Like I said before, SP is there to be used, someone has to use it. Let your damage dealer do their damage. Okay, so this first combo I'm showing you is basically the most optimal combo you can do. And that's because it has the most maximum damage. Basically, this is using her ultimate whilst you have a complete hand 4 of a kind. And this allows the ultimate to benefit from that 4 of a kind attack buff. So you can see I get the autarky buff. And then now I also give additional buffs with Bronya's ultimate and Tingyun's ultimate. So this is basically maximum damage. Both her ultimate and her first basic attack are benefiting from that hidden hand attack buff, and it's only the follow attack that doesn't benefit from it. Now obviously another thing about this that can either be a benefit or a negative is that usually when you use Qingque's ultimate you get the automatic 4 of a kind. Now that obviously saves you SP for your next basic attack, but why we don't care about that this time is because getting that automatically means you can't buff her. You can't buff her trying to get it manually on her next turn. So you will need to start from scratch again, but if you're going for maximum damage, that's a good thing. This just requires you being very careful with managing your SP. So why am I casting Bronya's ultimate and Tingyun's ultimate after Qingque's skill? It stops the buffs from counting down on their first turn, so they last 1 turn longer. So that lasted 3 turns. Now I can show you what happens if you use Bronya's ultimate early. So you can see here in the menu, I've got the Bellabog March lasting 2 turns. But because I casted it early, you can now see that the Bellabog March has actually gone down to 1 turn remaining. Now I've put here a few reasons why this can still be okay, and it's not the end of the world if you don't get that turn extension. 2 of the reasons can be that if you want that extra skill point with her light cone, or if you want that extra team speed right now if she's using Hackerspace Relic set, and also the buffs lasting 1 more turn won't matter if your fight isn't going to last that long anyway. So now this time, if you want to save some SP, you can use Qingque's ultimate after her basic attacks and follow-up attack if you have it. And how you do this properly is spamming the ultimate button during the animations of her basic attack and follow-up. So I'll show you that again. So I'm going to show you how to do this properly, because the reason why you spam the ultimate button during the basic attack animations is because the ultimate can still get the damage boost from her elemental skill. This is because technically if you spam it, it's still Qingque's turn and it hasn't gone to the next character. The main difference with this one is because you've already thrown away the hidden hand, her ultimate won't benefit from that hidden hand attack buff, but instead you will benefit from the ultimate generating a full hand after. Of course, when you use that basic attack, it won't have the highest damage, but it will save you SP. So a reason why you might use this is if some enemies are about to do some big damage and you need to worry about survivability and not spending all your SP on Qingque the next cycle. Now this next one is a lifesaver to know. And basically if you spend a lot of SP but you don't manage to complete your tiles and get 4 of a kind, then you can actually use her ultimate to automatically give you 4 of a kind and save your turn. And now I've got a full hand and I've still got Otaki. Now obviously this enemy didn't have enough HP to show the follow-up attack, but I did have it. This is another reason why it's very good on Qingque to save her ultimate and use it on her turn and use it when you need it rather than just spamming it. Here's another combo. It's not going to be intentional, but this will happen fairly often in game, and that is Qingque getting the 4 of the kind very early before you even get a chance to stack buffs. Now obviously if you have her E6, since you haven't spent any SP at all that turn, it means you just generated 1 SP. So there's still some positives, but obviously this isn't going to be the highest damaging attack. However, if you are using her with bronya, here's an example on how bronya can help so it doesn't feel bad if you didn't get to stack buffs on 1 turn. So you can see here my team's SP is very high and I didn't get to stack buffs on Qingque. So bronya using her skill helps Qingque get another turn very quickly, and even though she's barely had time to generate off-field tiles, you can still be fairly confident to use all your SP and get another go. Now this one isn't really a unique combo, but it is a useful tech to know, which is with Tingyun's ultimate. Obviously there's 2 parts of her ultimate. One part is that she refills energy for your DPS, and the other part of the ultimate is that she gives a damage buff. So especially because, as we've covered before, Qingque can help extend the damage buff, I usually prefer to use Tingyun's ultimate even if I have a full ultimate on Qingque, just to benefit from that damage buff. But if you do care about the energy more, after you use her ultimate, you can use Tingyun's ultimate and it will refill Qingque's energy and it will give her the damage buff for her basic attack and follow-up attack. Lastly, here's a bonus tech. Now this can be something very useful in the memory of chaos, but if you're fighting multiple waves of enemies and the first wave is almost over, if the enemies are very low HP and you don't need a full Qingque combo, but you do have 4 of a kind or Taki, you have her ultimate, then sometimes I prefer just using her ultimate on that low HP enemy, and this will allow you to save 4 of a kind or Taki and full buffs for the next wave. So before I get into these calcs, yes, I could take all these numbers here, turn it into a rotation and then give a DPS calc for Qingque, and then you could start comparing that with other characters. But I'm not going to do that. To be honest, I really don't like how a lot of the Star Rail community likes doing damage comparisons and comparing different characters with each other. No disrespect to anyone, but I do find it very shallow and misleading. In a game like this, especially with a character like Qingque, you can't really assume a rotation. It doesn't really work like that. So the first thing we have to understand about Calcs in this game is that they can differ depending on the exact team, exact scenario, like whether you're fighting one enemy or multiple enemies, and the actual combo and inputs that you do. Especially with Qingque, she has so much more variations on what you can do than most other characters. And this is actually why I don't turn all these calcs into a single team rotation damage calc either. I think that can be very misleading, and I actually don't really like DPS calcs in Star Rail. That's just a personal preference thing. So this is why instead I just have a ton of different scenarios, and then we can just understand how things can vary from that. What I do like about my calcs is that I have both single target, blast and AoE. I have different teammate buffs, and unfortunately this took a long time to calc. Did I find slightly different percents depending on the situation? Yes. Was it worth the time? Probably not. But hopefully this is a good resource for the community, so you can share this around, and if you do notice any mistakes then let me know. So now we can get into my calculations, which I have for light cone comparisons and for planar ornament comparisons, which are the last two relics. Now you might be wondering, why did you do planar ornament calculations? Qingque is a basic attack character, so Rutilant Arena is obviously her best set. Actually, that is not always the case, and that's why I did these calculations. So even though Qingque does do very strong basic attacks, she still does do follow-up attacks and ultimate, so she does still benefit from inert salsotto. And also, as we've seen in the combo section, her ultimate doesn't always benefit from the 4 of a kind attack buff, and her follow-up attack doesn't benefit from that attack buff no matter what. So the attack from Space Healing Station might be more valuable than you think. Another aspect that can complicate these calculations further is that her basic attack and her follow-up attack are blast attacks. That means that they deal most of their damage to the first enemy that you're targeting, and then they deal weaker damage to the 2 enemies on the side. In comparison, her ultimate deals the same damage to all enemies, and it can even hit more than 3 enemies too. So that means that I have to calculate how AoE can affect these calculations, and it can affect the calculations a bit. So what I've done is I've done a variety of different combos. You can recognize some of these from the combo section earlier, but I've also compared some single target versus some AoE situations, as well as some unlucky situations where you just only get her basic attack. And I've used Space Sealing Station as the base, and then I've compared Rutilant Arena against these ones. And you can see sometimes Rutilant Arena gives more damage, or sometimes Rutilant Arena can be giving less damage. And then I did the same thing with inert salsotto, and it has the same thing too. Sometimes it gives more damage than Space Healing Station, and sometimes it gives less damage. I did this for a variety of weapons, and you can see some of my results here. So you can see the ranges here. For example, with the seriousness of breakfast, if you're using Bronya's full buffs and Tingyun's full buffs, Rutilant Arena can range from 1.4% better to 2.5% better, and inert salsotto ranging from 1.4% to 2.7%. Now I've got to say that I'm only looking at 3 or 4 stacks on your skill. You know, this is already a lot of different variations, and it would just get even more ridiculous if I looked at 1 or 2 stacks too. And all these calcs were still way too much for me anyway. So why can inert salsotto sometimes have a higher ceiling than Rutilant Arena? You can see here it's a 0.2% higher ceiling. This is because it buffs her ultimate and her follow-up attack, and in particular her ultimate scales really well in AoE situations. And even though her basic attack might have the biggest numbers overall, it's only part of her damage, and her ultimate and her follow-up attack are still doing big damage itself. However, I do also look at if you're just doing the basic attack, Rutilant Arena wins by quite a lot across the board, anywhere from 3% to almost 7%. So if you get unlucky and you rarely get her follow-up attack and you don't have ultimate, then in these situations, her basic attack is the only real attack you're doing, so Rutilant Arena benefits a lot. However, I did grey out basic attacks in this table, and it's just because I don't really think people are trying to optimize for the bad luck situations, but it's still useful to know. I think you'll care more about optimizing for your proper DPS windows. Now, as you can see, I've also looked at different buff variations. You can see here, this is a full one that has tingyun and bronya, and then there's ones that just have bronya stuff, and then there's ones that have no buffs. In regards to calcing with other teammates, debuffers shouldn't actually impact these results much because they don't actually give Qingque personal buffs. Obviously, I could do other harmony characters that do give buffs like Yukong or Asta, but that can be something maybe I could do in the future. These calcs took a long time as it is, but it's still useful to know how different buffs can affect these calcs. For example, the less buffs you have, like you can see in these nothing active, then you can actually reach points where Space Healing Station can even be better, and you can see the floor of these other two sets are reaching the negative numbers. Now, I will put this sheet in the video description if you do want to check these out in detail yourself, but I don't want to drag on this section, so I'll just get into some conclusions now. When she's got a lot of buffs, when she's fully buffed up in her teams, the 24% attack from Space Healing Station can even just be similar to the 8% crit rate you get from the other two sets by themselves. And that just goes to show how valuable crit is compared to how valuable attack is. So you can look at here, before dawn with Space Healing Station, basic attack 55k, and then inert salsotto, which doesn't buff basic attacks. You can see it's basically exactly the same, just because of the 8% crit rate. Sometimes you might not reach the 70% crit rate threshold for rutilant arena, or even the 50% crit rate for inert salsotto, God forbid, but that 8% crit rate is still valuable enough by itself. So that means that a lot of these small differences are just the secondary passive effects. And in that, we learned that Rutilant Arena pulls ahead in more single target situations or when you have less luck, whereas Inert Salsotto can pull slightly ahead. We're looking at very small decimal points here, but it can pull slightly ahead with more and more enemies. However, I think it's very important to put into context these numbers. These numbers are around only 2% better generally, and that is generally only about one substat. For example, before dawn Rutilant Arena, you can see there's a lot of 1%, 2% betters than Space Healing Stations. This is with equal substats, but if I give my Space Healing Station one more substat, so I change 12 crit rate into 13 crit rate, you can see all those positive numbers turn into negative numbers. That's how fine these margins are, and it really puts everything into perspective here. Even Rutilant Arena at its peak, with bronya active, you can see here 3.6% better. That's probably only still 2 substats better if you are reaching that 70% crit rate threshold. So you really should just be using whichever set has the better substats, and that should be your best one for you personally. And I know a lot of people farmed Space Healing Station before, so they might have better sets for that. So if you've got 1 or 2 crit substats more on your Space Healing Station, then that might be your best set. And also lastly, I really don't think it's worth forcing Rutilant Arena if you don't have good stats. For example, scuffed ratios like maybe 70% crit rate, but you only have like 90 or 100 crit damage. The set bonus is not that good. So now we can get into my light cone comparisons. Now, unlike the planar ornament calculations, just to save space, I'm actually only looking at Rutilant Arena and a few combos and just 2 versions of the buffs. Just some full buffs with bronya and tingyun, the bronya stuff, and then without any buffs. But even just this gives a bit more of a detailed comparison than just looking at one scenario and looking at very shallow calculations there. And you can see here before dawn, if you have a full combo, it can be 112%. But if you only do a base attack, it can be 8%. So the base comparison here is the seriousness of breakfast. This is the free to play weapon, and it's a very good weapon still. It's quite easy to get super impositions, either from Forgotten Hall grinding, and you can also get some copies sometimes from Echo of War weekly bosses. This is with the passive active, this is with the attack buffs from enemies being defeated. You can see it does drop to her worst weapon if enemies aren't defeated. That's because at that point you're just getting 24% damage and you're not getting that 24% attack. Now there is also the battle pass weapon. Today is another peaceful day. The way this works is it uses your character's maximum energy. So with Qingque it's 140, so you can do 20% of that and it ends up to be 28% damage for all her attacks. So that can be quite useful. However, as you can tell, just that damage, even though it does have higher base attack than the seriousness of breakfast, it's lacking that attack buff, and so it's actually worse than seriousness of breakfast. However, if you buy multiple battle passes and you get it all the way to super imposition 5, it doubles in value, so it goes from 28% to 56%. And at that point, you can see I'm getting to 4% to 5% better. So the fact it's unconditional, it buffs all their attacks, and you don't need the enemies defeated like you do with seriousness of breakfast. That does make it quite a bit of an upgrade. However, just like with the planar ornament calcs, 5% is only maybe 2 to 3 substats better. So in the grand scheme, it's really not that big of a deal. However, I will note that if you are someone who buys the battle pass anyway, most other light cones there aren't really that great or useful. So I'm sure a lot of you are getting Peaceful Day as it's just the only decent one there. So then there's Genius's Repose, which is just a fully gacha weapon, and it gives attack, and when you defeat an enemy you get a lot of crit damage for 3 turns. It's quite a lot of turns actually, but you can see it ranges from quite a lot better to Peaceful Day to even worse than S1 Peaceful Day if you don't defeat an enemy and you don't get that crit damage buff. And to be honest, I've only looked at S5, and at S1 you only get 24% crit damage compared to S5 you get 48% crit damage. Lastly, looking at her best in slot light cone, which is Qingque's light cone, Before Dawn. This is a 5-star, so it has the highest basic attack and it gives the most amount of stats. You can see it gives crit damage, which is very valuable. And then you get extra damage from her ultimate since Qingque doesn't use her skill. And then you get a lot of follow-up attack damage. Now Before Dawn, it does have the most range out of all the weapons. This is because a lot of its power is in that follow-up attack buff. And if you aren't getting her follow-up attack, then you do lose out on a big part of this light cone. So you can see in my calculations, it does drop quite a lot if you're only using that basic attack. But if you are getting full combos, even if you're not getting the maximum combo, it's still a great weapon. And I'm still confident in saying it's her best light cone overall. So here's just the general ranking. And I think in general, Qingque really does want a lot of crit. I'd just like to say though, for Before Dawn, I don't actually think this is a peak potential light cone for her. I don't think this is a future-proof light cone for her either. This is because a lot of its power budget is in the skill damage buff and the follow-up attack damage buff. And that's obviously slightly more tailored to Qingque's playstyle. And I think it's very possible if we get future erudition characters in the future, and if their light cones are slightly more generic, slightly more universal, and maybe they buff basic attacks too, I think light cones like that could be easily better than Before Dawn, and maybe they can even go from 12% to 20% better than breakfast. So I would say even though Before Dawn's her best light cone now, I wouldn't rush to get it on a potential rerun. You never know when the next erudition character is coming out. So these were the planar ornament calcs. I know some people do want to see calcs on your main relics, but to be honest, the quantum set is just the set that you want to farm. It's actually a really efficient set to farm. That is because it's really good on quantum characters. This defense ignore is very useful, and it gets even better with teammates like Pela or Silver Wolf. And even if you're using another DPS that isn't a quantum character, they can all benefit from this defense ignore. And sometimes this can even be a very strong set for random characters too. Another reason why this is a very good set to farm is because a teammate like Silver Wolf can also use this set. And also this other damage reduction set, you might think that's bad, but it actually can be very useful on your supports. Improving their survivability is very useful. I know another popular question is asking about attack boots versus speed boots, and they do have very slightly different strategies. If you're using attack boots, then you're slower, which means you generate more off-field tiles, which means Qingque uses less SP directly. Also, if she's slower, that means teammates get more turns to generate SP. That means less SP is used indirectly too. And if you're using Bronya in her team, because of her action advance forward, then that can mitigate Qingque being slow and you can have less issues with losing turns. So all that, plus the fact that attack can have higher max hits, can make attack boots very strong. However, faster speed with speed boots means that Qingque can cycle through turns faster, which can also equal more damage, and it can also equal more SP generated too, especially if you're factoring in her E6. Also, this one is very important, but getting less free tiles off field, because Qingque is getting more turns now relative to her teammates, It means you get more chances to use her skill during her own turn, which means you get more buffs on her and you get more chance of a follow-up attack. So overall, although this is a very real debate, there is no real right answer. And people have been able to speedrun with both, so both are fine. Ultimately, you should use whichever you have better relics on. Like for example, I use these speed boots just because I don't actually have any attack boots, let alone decent attack boots. I know speed boots are technically rarer, but this is what I got. And there honestly is no point me telling you to use speed, but if you have strong attack boots and vice versa, you should really just use whichever one you have. Although there is different playstyles, it's really not that big of a deal. Bear in mind, she also does get a trace at levels 70, 80 ascended, which gives her a speed boost, so her speed is never going to be awful. On her technique, it does let her start with a few extra tiles, but actually I rarely use this technique before battle. I'm sure you've realised by now, but although you can generate more tiles faster, as we know that can mean you're just losing out on damage because it means you might not get to use her skill that much. And I think generally it's better to have to roll more to make sure you're buffing her properly. In regards to leveling up her traces, focus first on this basic attack trace and getting this maxed out. It's a lot quicker to max out than the other traces, and obviously she does a lot of basic attack damage, so this is very nice. And then as for the other three, personally I think you should level these all up evenly. I got these all up to 11 and I ended up maxing the talent first, but you could max out either of these first. It's really hard to give a definitive answer just because don't always use her ultimate, and once you get to later levels, this damage buff from her skill is only going up by 1. Bear in mind for her skill trace, this extra 10% is additive with this. So this makes the later levels for this even less useful than you would think, because I'm on 29 plus 10 right now. So I'm getting 39 damage per skill, and it's only going to increase by 1 from that. So none of these are going to be big increases. Even at this point, for the final ultimate level, it's only going to be a 4% increase to ultimate damage. You know, at that point, these later stat traces like quantum damage here and attack boost here are probably going to be better than getting any of these anyway. But yeah, as long as you've got the basic attack maxed and then you've got these three evenly, decently leveled, and you've got all these stat traces, you can do whatever you want, whatever you have the resources for. This is her speed trace that I was talking about earlier. This is quite useful for her, and it's going to make her speed always decent even if you don't have much speed in your relics. And then this early trace here, which gives you a skill point the first time you use her skill in battle. This can also be very useful, especially because early in battles you probably don't have much SP. But yeah, Qingque is one of those characters where you don't even have to think. You should be unlocking all these traces here. In regards to her eidolons, I know this is a very hot topic. These first two eidolons are kind of whatever, they're alright, but nothing crazy. But a lot of people do want to know, because her E4 and her E6 are so good, is she worth playing at E3 and lower? Bear in mind you do get her for free in game, so she does need one less eidolon than a lot of other characters. To be honest, I did used to play her when I only had her at E2 and E3. But also, to be honest, I would say that her E4 is such a big damage spike. You might think, because this is only a 24% chance to get the follow-up attack, that it's not a big deal. But actually, that's per skill. So you've got to do 76% times 76% to not get it for your second skill, and then not get it for your third skill. It's about a 40% chance. So you can see very quickly, even just using her skill 3 times, it's almost a 60% chance, which means you're more likely to get a follow-up attack than not get a follow-up attack. So given that this is like almost double damage to her basic attacks, and you're also dealing double damage to their toughness shield, which means you're breaking enemies faster too, this does make this a very strong eidolon. I would say, to be honest, if you don't have E4, then you don't really have to play her, unless you're like me and you really liked her anyway. And then, although her eidolon 6 is very good for SP generation, which can be a very big deal, I wouldn't say it's as necessary as eidolon 4. And I guess it doesn't technically affect her damage. I guess it helps her consistency more rather than her actual damage. In conclusion, I would say overall, once you do get her eidolon 6, she will be one of the strongest DPSs on your account, if not the strongest. And I have Kafka, I have Zila, and although I don't really like to compare characters like that, if I did have to compare, I would say that she is probably the best DPS I have. And she's very fun to play overall, and she is very strong overall. One topic I did want to cover is, at least in some aspects, why I think she's future-proof. Whether you're playing Memory of Chaos and there's these memory turbulences, or you're doing simulated universe and you're picking a path and buffs. As we know, the type of damage your character can do can be very important. It can often be the difference between feeling OP or feeling like your character isn't doing as much damage as you were doing before for some reason. So with Qingque, her big strength is, so far it feels like she can shine with almost anything. She deals basic attack damage, follow-up attack damage, ultimate damage. She can use a lot of skill points, as well as do both blast damage, which is the small AoE, or full AoE with the ultimate. And even just basic attack content, it does include this big gorilla, which targets you whenever you use a skill, or this Arumation Gatekeeper, who goes into sanction mode if you do skill or ultimate attacks. And also basic attack and follow-up attack damage buffs in Memory of Chaos so far have been some of the strongest buffs. Propagation for basic attacks and the follow-up paths are very strong. In fact, even the Memory of Chaos in 1.0, the original one that sped up hunt or erudition characters, Qingque benefited from that too. The only real ones that Qingque doesn't really benefit from is skill damage buffing stuff or DOT stuff, like when Kafka was on banner. And overall, I think Qingque having access to all these damage sources makes her benefit from so much content, and it's really hard to stop her, especially if you do get Silver Wolf and she can make content weak to Quantum. And whilst Qingque isn't the only character who has so many different attacks, for example, I think Blade has a lot of variety too. These types of characters are not very common, so I think this is a big advantage for her, especially as a 4-star character. And even though I said that she has some aspects of future-proofness, I think she's still got so much more future potential. For example, as I covered in the light cone section, even though Before Dawn is the strongest light cone, it still isn't that tailored to her playstyle. It's got a skill damage buff, which she doesn't benefit from, and it's got a lot of its power budget in the follow-up attack. It's not as significant to her as it is to Tingyun. And even I know the community complains a lot about erudition light cones in general, especially the 4-star ones. So in regards to both 4-star and 5-star light cones, I think it's very likely she can have upgrades in the future, whether it's a new light cone in the Herta store or whether a new 5-star erudition character comes out with a more synergistic light cone for Qingque. Also, it's not just about light cones, but it's also about current teammates. Although Qingque does use current teammates well, strictly looking at the buffs, as we know, she doesn't benefit from attack buffs or damage buffs as much as other characters, which don't give as much self buffs as Qingque does. This means she might be able to benefit more from future characters who give more crit buffs or give more resistance shred or defense shred buffs like Silverwolf does. There might also be teammates in the future which act a bit like propagation buffs, and they scale with the amount of skill points that you consume. She can also benefit there too. Then there's also Mono Quantum, which I know a lot of people are very excited for. And both Futureproof and Lynx are healers, so they can help with that. But I'm sure there can also be more Quantum characters coming in the future. Maybe more Quantum Nihility units or Quantum Harmony characters. And I'm sure as Mono Quantum gets more and more powerful, that Qingque will benefit too. Okay, so teams and teammates. First of all, I know a lot of people like to talk about sub-DPS, Qingque pairing her with different damage dealers, but to be honest, especially if you have her Eidolon 4 and her Eidolon 6, just use her as the main damage dealer. It's her main role, and you should just be pairing her with characters who can increase her damage and give survivability to the team. For example, 2 Harmony characters and a healer, or if you're playing harder content, you can have 1 Harmony character or a Nihility character, and you can have a healer and a shielder. I really don't like double DPS teams with her. I think it limits her potential as a proper damage dealer. So let's get into some teammates. I think it's safe to say that Bronya is the best teammate for most characters in Star Rail, and with Qingque there's no exception. Actually, I play Bronya a lot with both Zila and Qingque, and I think Qingque synergizes with Bronya even better. One of the main reasons is that Bronya lets you control your team situation, right? And when it's Bronya's turn, you can assess your SP situation, the amount of tiles Qingque already has, whether team buffs are available, and then if you're ready, you can immediately use Bronya's skill to action out your plan. I think this is significant, especially with Qingque's ability to deal massive amounts of damage in one turn, how she front loads all that SP into her own turn, and being able to better decide when to do this is extremely helpful. And even Bronya's skill buff by itself, this damage buff only lasts one turn. But just like with the 5-star Dunhong, Qingque's damage being dumped all in one turn rather than being spread out utilizes huge buffs like this as well. And it can get even more crazy if you have even more one-turn buffs like Bronya's Light Cone giving more damage or Past and Future giving more damage. Secondly, as we know, Qingque can extend buffs that are casted during her turn as long as her skill is already used. Bronya's ult is one of the buffs in the game which can be casted in this time, and it gives a huge attack and crit damage buff which are supposed to only last 2 turns. So getting an extra turn out of these buffs is very helpful, especially crit damage, which as we know crit stats are very valuable for Qingque. Lastly, as I covered in the combo section, Qingque to Bronya to Qingque fast turnaround combos are very helpful for Qingque in particular. These sorts of combos also do help other characters like Zila, but Qingque's damage is all about getting the right timing and dealing that massive damage in one turn. So Bronya giving her extra turns helps you find that right timing. This can be either if you're not ready and your team lacks SP to execute a full damage combo, or if your Qingque gained tiles too early and she will be unbuffed for one attack, you can get rid of that weak basic attack and then you can set up properly. There's also tingyun, and I know it's a common belief that Qingque doesn't have great synergy with tingyun, and in some ways that's true. However, you can also find equal amounts of ways which they have great synergy. First of all, I can go through the negatives, the obvious one being that Qingque benefits less from attack and damage buffs than other DPSs due to her massive self buffs. So it's true, it does make tingyun's buffs less efficient. Furthermore, tingyun giving energy to Qingque can be less efficient than with other DPSs, since as we know, Qingque isn't a DPS who wants to spam her burst whenever it's up. Whereas as we know, generally you want to save her ultimate for her own turn to maximize damage and buffs. Here's the other side of the coin though. Tingyun's benediction buffs, which are the extra hits that Qingque deals on her turn, as well as this Spark Nader, which are the extra hits that Tingyun deals on her own turn using Qingque's stats. These both benefit from characters with high attack and a lot of universal damage percent, and Qingque has both of these and it makes the extra hits hit very hard. Why is the universal damage important? It's because this extra attack is actually a lightning damage attack, meaning it doesn't benefit from the orbs that your DPSs might have. Like it doesn't benefit from Qingque's quantum damage, but it does benefit from a lot of the other damage buffs that Qingque has. Secondly, just as like we covered in Bronya's section, using buffs after Qingque uses her skill makes buffs last a turn longer. And just like with Bronya's ultimate, Tingyun's ultimate is one of these buffs which can be used during Qingque's turn like this. Therefore, you get 3 turns of this damage buff, which can be very high if you level up this trace, and you get her eidolon which levels up this trace too. Could be around 50% damage, and that's a pretty large buff even if Qingque is diluted with damage buffs already. A third point is, whilst Qingque doesn't spam her ultimate, having it available is nice. Especially if you fail to get a 4 of a kind, an ultimate can save your combo and it can save all your buffs. Fourth point is Tingyun is naturally very fast and SP positive, and that's a great fit alongside Qingque and her popular teammates like Bronya, who will want to use a lot of SP. And lastly, to be honest, Tingyun is a very popular support that many people would already have leveled up and built, so you might as well use her if she's available. There's also Pela, and if you've built her right with the event tutorial Light Cone and an energy regeneration rope, then you'll know she can constantly spam attacks to spam her ultimate for constant defense shred. And even if you have this resolution Light Cone, you can use that for even more defense shred. Defense debuffs are very good because, as we know, Qingque has a lot of buffs already, but debuffs are just separate multipliers and they're always going to be good. Defense shred in particular, it stacks with Qingque's Relic defense ignore, and this boosts the damage you gain from both. Also, Pela's ultimate being AoE defense shred is very useful because that synergizes well with Qingque and her ability to deal AoE damage. However, one negative with Pela is that she has to apply debuffs per enemy, and sometimes your Qingque is ready to go or she defeats enemies so fast that debuffs might not be active. However, this can be mitigated with Pela's first eidolon, which gives her energy whenever someone in your team defeats an enemy. I don't want to spend too much time on Silverwolf because unfortunately I'm a free-to-play who doesn't have her, and for my guys I prefer to talk from experience. However, obviously I know she is very useful for Qingque, maybe second only to Bronya in terms of Qingque's best teammates. First of all, the ability to put quantum weakness on enemies can help you bring Qingque everywhere, so you don't have to worry about benching her sometimes. This extra res reduction that Silverwolf can do is also a great unique multiplier for Qingque who doesn't really have access to it already. Also, just like Pela, Silverwolf having defense debuffs are a very valuable multiplier for Qingque, and it stacks with the quantum relic set. And speaking of relics and that set, Silverwolf can also use this quantum set, although her relics will probably focus more on effect hit rate and break effect, but this means you can farm for both Qingque and Silverwolf at the same time. Lastly, Silverwolf being a quantum character can also help with putting together mono quantum teams. One downside of Silverwolf though is that her debuffs are mostly single target, so in comparison to Pela, it doesn't really take advantage of Qingque's AoE potential. Lastly, there's Yukong. Her buffs are massive, it's a lot of attack and crit. The downside being that they're only supposed to last a very short time. But again, that does synergize very well with Qingque, since as we've covered many times already, Qingque consumes a lot of SP to deal big damage in one turn anyway. Especially the crit buffs, as we know Qingque really likes crit stats. And even this crit rate can help you hit certain crit rate milestones, like on your planar ornament sets to activate these secondary effects. However, to be honest, I don't really play Yukong at all. Unlike characters like Tingyun or Pela, Yukong really wants her eidolons, especially this eidolon 6. So if you're like me and you don't have that and you haven't built it yet, I don't really think there's a rush to build her. Although I do know that if you're speedrunning and you're playing a team with no healers and just 3 buffers, that Yukong is very popular there. But most people aren't going to be speedrunning like that. In conclusion, outside of maybe Bronya and Silverwolf being probably the outright best supports for Qingque, Bronya in particular, basically all the other popular buffers or debuffers are good options, and it can really come down to preference or just which ones you have built or which ones are not already taken by your other team. And obviously for the last slot you can just put whatever good healer or shielder you have, most likely a healer though, especially if you have Watcher. There's no real need for me to get into the differences between the healers because it should just be the same with Qingque as with a lot of other characters. The 2 exceptions though, which haven't come out yet, which would be Futureproof and Links. Obviously them being quantum, they can be good options for Qingque, either to help get those mono quantum teams, or also if you're bringing Qingque into quantum weak content and you want more break. Hope you found this video helpful. Qingque is one of my favorite characters to play. I play her all the time and I might make more videos about her too. Let me know if I missed out on a topic that you wanted me to cover. Maybe I can make an FAQ or I can just reply to your comment directly. Thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed.